Hey, it's the Bowery Boys.
Hey.
Hi there, welcome to the Bowery Boys. This is Greg Young.
And this is Tom Myers. And today we're looking back to the Lower East Side, to one of the neighborhood's most distinctive features during the 19th and early 20th centuries, the Pushcarts, which was really an entire retail system of buying and selling food and clothing and other items, which first rolled out onto the streets in the late 19th century.
Of course, today, how we get groceries and street food is different in some ways. Of course, we have huge grocery stores that offer the worldwide delicacies. You've got your Wegmans and your Whole Foods, your Trader Joe's, all the way down to your local supermarket. And of course, if you're really just too busy, you can even order your groceries for delivery online. So New Yorkers obviously did not have those things in the 19th century.
No, but they did have outdoor markets, just like we do today in many of New York's public parks and, neighborhood plazas. And we also have sidewalk food carts and, of course, food trucks, which are in many ways quite similar to the old pushcarts in that they offer all kinds of, tasty things to eat right there from the convenience of your sidewalk or your corner.
I mean, I ate at a food truck last night and I went to a market last week. So I guess there's actually a lot to relate to.
Are you living in the 1890s?
No, 2026. Although this is a show that's actually a rebroadcast of a show that we did 6 years ago in 2020. And I just wanted to say that because like many things that we did during that period, 2020, despite being one of our absolute favorite shows in recent years, most of you probably forgot we even recorded this.
Or you never even heard it in the first place. But as you will hear today, the show isn't only about pushcarts, but it's also about how New Yorkers used to buy food, going all the way back to actually the New Amsterdam days. But by the late 19th century, when thousands of Eastern European immigrants began moving to the Lower East Side, they brought with them this new, very portable way of selling food and selling so much more. And this became very, very popular amongst locals, but also, people who didn't even live in the neighborhood came to take part of this. And you've probably seen those iconic old photographs of Orchard Street or Hester Street from this period when it was just absolutely crammed with pushcarts and shoppers.
But this chaos did not please Mayor Fiorello La Guardia, who in the 1930s advocated for getting those carts off the street and into regulated market buildings, leading to another great icon of the Lower East Side. This is one of the 20th century variety known as the Essex Street Market at Delancey and Essex Streets,
which stayed in that space until 2019, when a much slicker version opened just across Delancey Street called Essex Market. So modern, but also still lined with independent merchants dishing up delicious food.
So grab a tote bag as we explore the history of the pushcart and markets of the Lower East Side. So today we're going to talk about the various ways that people bought food in the city throughout history, and specifically in outdoor markets and later from pushcarts.
Yes, because both of those traditions, buying on the streets and in market halls, go all the way back, actually, to the beginning, to New Amsterdam.
Did they actually have street vendors back then? Like, could you pick up an oily cook from a street vendor on the road to Peter Stuyvesant's farm?
Yes, Peter Stuyvesant could pick up some oily cooks in his cart because, Greg, New Amsterdam ran on oily cooks.
Is that a Dunkin' Donut joke you just made?
It's a bit of a stretch, but I'm going to keep it in. There were indeed outdoor merchants who sold their goods down by Fort Amsterdam at the southern tip of Manhattan.
And did city officials just allow people to sell food wherever they wanted here?
Well, in 1641, the Dutch authorities established a market day for New Amsterdam with farmers and Native Americans arriving to sell their goods. And it was so popular that the authorities constructed a public market hall in 1656. And then 2 years later, the settlement erected a meat market next to the fort as well. And that was called the Broadway Shambles. I want to note that New Amsterdam was already regulating these markets and the vendors, especially the butchers. By the 1680s, under British rule, these markets would be open to shoppers every day of the week.
But so we're going to go back and forth between two different concepts here. Those who sold within markets, and then, of course, those individual sellers who sold out on the streets on their own. So could you do that during this period as well?
No, actually, as I mentioned, the city was very strict about regulations. And for the sake of public health and sanitation, once these markets were in place, the sale of produce and meat was strictly regulated and took place only inside the markets. Street vendors were referred to as hucksters, and they were outlawed. And that law would stay on the books in New York for more than 150 years, until the 1840s.
And that's actually a very surprising historical fact to learn. I don't know, like that kind of regulation that early in New York period is surprising to me.
Yeah. I mean, I actually kind of geeked out on this. I couldn't get over the fact that there was so much regulation early on. And then it just sort of like, well, we'll get to it in a second, but it kind of falls apart.
But it seems like then that these markets had a monopoly then on selling food to customers.
Yeah, in that the food that was being sold and consumed within New Amsterdam and New York was tightly regulated. And that was a good thing.
But this is incredibly limiting, of course. If you needed food at any time of the day, this is, many, many decades before the advent of grocery stores or even bodegas, obviously, to go pick up stuff.
Not to mention centuries away from Amazon Fresh or Instacart. You had to go on your own to the marketplace, or you had to send somebody in the house to the market to pick up the produce and visit the butcher. And it was a daily or near daily trip, given, the obvious lack of refrigeration.
So here in the colonial period, as the city got larger, I guess they needed to build more markets. They couldn't just have one.
Yeah, especially because they had this concept of being able to walk easily, to your neighborhood market. So if your neighborhood didn't have a market yet, the residents could actually get permission to build one themselves if they could raise their own funds, which is what the residents of Pearl Street did when they built the Fly Market at the base of Maiden Lane at the East River in 1699. And this would continue in other neighborhoods. By the 1720s, the city had 5 markets. And this system continued throughout the 18th century.
What's fascinating is that even through the Revolutionary War years, a war-torn city, they all still had to eat. So these markets were still in operation, which is pretty remarkable. And, you might have people, Sons of the Revolution meetings, and then stopping at the market for some meat.
Francis Tavern was right in the middle of multiple marketplaces. After the Revolution, more markets would be added, older ones would be expanded. For example, the Fly Market grew to be housed in 3 different buildings, one for fish, one for produce, and one for meats. And I should mention, sadly, that some of these markets also functioned at times as slave markets, including the busy Fly Market. That market, the Fly Market, became so run down that it was replaced in 1816 by the nearby Fulton Market, which opened in 1822.
And at that time then, in the 1820s, right? So that is a pretty monumental decade for New York City and really the beginning of massive growth in the city because of the wealth that would stream in because of the Erie Canal, which opened that decade.
Yes, in 1825. And yes, that wealth would stream in. Nicely put. But to illustrate that, by 1820, Manhattan's population was 123,000, okay? By 1830, that would be 202,000. 10 years later, in 1840, 312. And by 1850, 515,000. That is a lot of new mouths to feed and a lot of new markets to build. Quoting from the Encyclopedia of New York City, markets built during the first half of the 19th century included, quote, the Grand Marketplace and the Corlair's Hook, Collect, Greenwich, Governor, Washington, Fish, Center, Essex, Franklin, Manhattan, Clinton, Tompkins, Jefferson, Monroe, and Harlem markets.
What? That is quite a laundry list of markets that just popped up here all of a sudden. And in fact, one of those markets you just mentioned is Essex Market, which we're going to be talking about later in the show.
Yes, that original Essex Market was established in 1818 and was located along Grand Street between Essex and Ludlow Streets. I'm looking at an illustrated map of the city's 13 markets at this time, including the Essex Market, which was one of the smallest, as it was just located on that one block, covered and on the street. So over on the Essex Street side, you first encountered the fish sellers, then the produce sellers, but most of the strip consisted of the butchers, with 18 different stalls for butchers.
And when you say like on the street, you mean like really just on the blocks along the streets, right?
No. This market was located on the street. Imagine like a street fair today. That's how the market was, just on that block of Grand Street. You can even see on this map, like you see where the sidewalks are, and then you see the stalls in the street. So imagine that block with a roof over it, and that was your Essex Market. So here, the Essex Market is a good example of a small neighborhood market, but some are really large, including the Fulton Market, and the largest, by the 1830s, was the Washington Market.
And the Washington Market was enormous. And it had access, of course, to all of the railroads and the ships crossing the Hudson. And it was open for over a century.
For more than a century and a half, in fact, because it dates all the way back pre-railroad to 1812. And it would continue to exist in some form until 1967. It was built on Washington, Fulton, and Vesey Streets, where One World Trade Center is today. And it would soon become the largest food market in the country.
And that, just to be clear, is an example of a market that would serve retail. You could just roll in and buy something, but was also for wholesalers, where people who owned, hotels and companies or whatever could go in and just buy in bulk.
Yeah, or distributors of food. That massive wholesale market developed north of that smaller retail one in the second half of the 19th century. That stretched about a dozen blocks north of that original retail market. Today, in fact, there's a Washington Market Park at the northern end of that wholesale market at Chambers Street, which is sort of nestled into Manhattan Community College.
We get to the Lower East Side and the arrival of the Pushcarts right after this. So we have all of these markets of a certain size all over the city right here by the middle of the 19th century. So then what happens to these markets when the population of New York suddenly explodes with these huge waves of European immigration, which began in the 30s and 40s and 50s here?
Well, in short, the city was up against some really big challenges about how to grow, how to get water, what to do about housing. And one of these challenges was food, how to get enough food. Because this regulated system of marketplaces simply was not holding up with the population growth that the city was experiencing. Because Manhattan's population would more than triple in the second half of the 19th century, from about 500,000 in 1850 to about 1.85 million people living in Manhattan by 1900. So there would just be so many residents to feed, and those tight regulations that I mentioned before were just relaxed, or they were abolished. And food and food distribution and food retailing became a bit more of a free-for-all.
So a Wild West for food, essentially. So did the city just stop building markets? Like, what happened?
Pretty much, yeah. The market stopped at about 10th Street, except for the Harlem market. So this actually presented an opportunity, for small independent vendors to sell food. in spots that were not being served by the markets. And also to sell food at cut rate prices that were actually lower than what you would find in the markets. And in many cases, these independent sellers were able to buy up surplus food that was coming in to the new wholesale markets. To quote from the book Gotham by Mike Wallace and Edwin Burrows, quote, "This non-expansion policy," talking about the fact that the city wasn't building new markets, "created a vacuum which thousands of small retailers, chiefly immigrants, rushed to fill. Many started as peddlers. Irish women hawked vegetables from street corner stands. Germans purveyed small manufactured goods, and Italians sold fruit and flowers."
And those things that you described would increasingly be sold via pushcarts, which I'm going to get to in just a second. But What you've described, those aren't farmers. Like earlier in the story, it seemed to me that those were people who brought things to market from their own farms, or to the butchers from their own farms.
Yeah, farmers now in the late 1800s had another option. They could sell their food that they raised themselves in season at the Gansevoort Farmers Street Market at the intersection of Gansevoort, Washington, and Little West 12th Street, today's meatpacking district. Actually, the Gansevoort Farmers Street Market was located where the Whitney Museum is located today. That farmers market opened in 1884, and it would function until the 1920s, when this marketplace would be transformed into a meatpacking and meat processing district.
But let's back up a bit and actually narrow our story here.
Roll the cart back,
actually. And let's return to the 1880s. That's when the Gansevoort market was during this decade. Well, it was in this decade that we see an increase in a phenomenon known as the pushcart, or pushcart sales, which were a type of individual entrepreneur, usually involving just a single salesperson working on their own, selling mostly raw, sometimes occasionally baked food, using a hand-drawn cart, and sometimes even a horse-drawn cart.
And you're talking about the 1880s, right in the middle of this huge increase in immigration, specifically Eastern European and Jewish immigration.
Right, and many of these new immigrants brought with them the tradition of pushcart sales. Back in their former countries, most of these people could not afford or rent their own storefronts. And in fact, in many cases, they weren't even allowed to own storefronts due to the anti-Semitism that they experienced in those places. But here in New York, these populations lived in dense tenement neighborhoods, the largest being here in the Lower East Side. And thus, they could make a living operating a pushcart. And these pushcarts created a sort of portable outdoor market that provided inexpensive food that often catered to the unique ethnic styles and dietary restrictions of the people who lived here.
And their customers would be people who lived and worked along these streets?
Yes.
Where their carts were located, which is interesting if you think about the Lower East Side. People were working long hours. Perhaps they didn't have time to get to one of these markets.
Yeah.
And maybe they had really limited access to kitchens.
Well, and one of these benefits of the peddlers is they could often stay there the whole night. They even had lanterns and even later electric lights attached to their pushcarts. They offered a real convenience, and thus you could find them all over in nearly every working class neighborhood in New York. And here in the Lower East Side, it essentially became an unofficial stationary market along the streets. The first documented cases, the ones that popped up in the newspapers that we were able to find, appeared in 1886 with 4 regular pushcarts lined along Hester Street. But soon, most of the streets of the Lower East Side were lined with peddlers of all types selling all sorts of things. So food mostly, because that's what we're focusing on. But you could also buy like old clothing, needles and thread, small appliances even.
That's a lot to push around, if you think about it.
Yes.
Was this even legal? Were these licensed vendors?
So yes and no, or I should say the trade was actually legal by this point in the late 19th century. You would need a license eventually, but there would actually be a larger number of unlicensed push carts because, of course, you'd need a bit of, investment beforehand to get a license, but a lot of people didn't even have that. And, of course, there was a rule on the books that peddlers could only park in one place for about 30 minutes.
Oh.
And then you would need to move on, right? But that was never, of course, enforced. I mean, how could you?
That seems really impractical. And plus, you'd spend so much time trying to get a good spot. And then what, you'd have to move a half an hour later?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't a doable idea in any way.
So I'm just trying to visualize this. You've got...
Yeah.
On these streets, you've got stores already, and then there's a little bit of sidewalk, and then you have the push carts, which might be on the sidewalk, but many were in the streets themselves, and required to keep moving every 30 minutes or so. I can imagine that there are just a lot of shopping options here. You probably wouldn't even need to go to one of those municipal markets.
I mean, it's for many people, that's true. I mean, you could buy anything here in the streets of the Lower East Side. Produce, fish, cheese, pickles, chestnuts, candy. I mean, you name it.
You're making me hungry.
But unlike the markets, these, of course, were naturally extremely unregulated. And you also have to kind of compare the work of the pushcart operator with that of other street professions like newsies or bootblacks. Essentially early in the morning, you had to fight for an ideal spot on an ideal street. It could be very brutal work, but you did have a sense of independence if you were a pushcart operator compared to, your neighbors and other family members who worked in sweatshops. But you were also subject to terrible work conditions, rain, sleet, snow, and of course, like a street system itself that could be, very corrupt.
So on the one hand, it sounds like complete chaos, unregulated chaos, right?
Mm-hmm.
But on the other hand, it sounds like it's providing a real service to the neighborhood. It's providing employment. It's also providing affordable shopping options for food. But also, if there's this corruption, I mean, did the city think that they needed to get involved? Did they try to get involved?
They certainly did. They made some efforts. Even here into the early 20th century, even with more defined marketplace areas in the city, as the city developed their own markets in the early 20th century under bridges and vacant lots and things like that, the street pushcart peddler thrived. In fact, they were so ubiquitous on the streets of the Lower East Side that they were even seen as part of the unique character of New York City. One writer in 1930 even said, quote, "The pushcart markets are as characteristic a part of the New York pageant as skyscrapers."
So by 1930, when he said that in 1930, pushcarts are still really a thing in these streets. I mean, the city has changed quite a bit by now, thinking about, automobiles and such. So there's more that they're fighting with in the streets. But by 1930, obviously, we're also entering into the Great Depression. And, pushcarts are also offering employment or income to their vendors and also still providing discounted goods and food to the populations that they served.
No, I mean, they were very vital to people who had less money, obviously. I would even say that one of the iconic images of the Great Depression is that of a pushcart salesman selling 5-cent apples to customers, right? So if food that was, of course, quite plentiful in New York and, might provide sustenance for a whole day for many people in need. To quote from the author Suzanne Wasserman from the wonderful book Gastropolis, quote, "The Depression greatly exacerbated the precarious economic conditions. By 1930, 47,000 family members depended on earnings made from pushcarts, which generated $40 to $50 million each year. More than 50% of all pushcarts in the city were to be found on the Lower East Side."
But even as they were providing this social good, right, this social benefit, I mean, by 1930, again, just thinking about cars and such and the traffic, it just seems like these pushcarts were hindering sanitation, just getting and traffic and getting in the way.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's actually a little up for debate, which I find interesting because, it's not like a lot of these Lower East Side streets, for instance, were major thoroughfares. It would be a little different if it was on Broadway or even, on Delancey.
Because we're talking about like Orchard Street and Hester Street.
Yes, Orchard and Hester and all of the sort of smaller streets of the Lower East Side. But people are raising these concerns, and I think what we see here during this period is some anti-immigrant sentiment in this, quote, cleanup of peddlers on the street. These were like generations of immigrant business people with businesses that weren't, organized or necessarily attractive to some people. These weren't like well-dressed peddlers. And the food they were selling was often ethnic food, or in other words, fast food. But on the other hand, by this point, you had many generations of people who had been operating pushcarts and visitors from other neighborhoods who had, say, grown up in the Lower East Side and returned. Well, they actually found a bit of nostalgia in the image of the pushcart. But developers and merchants saw this thriving component of immigrant life here in the Lower East Side as actually a deterrent of growth in the city.
And so all those points were really excuses that the city was using to sell its campaign to get rid of these pushcarts.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in that respect, though, it is a little ironic to me that the man who finally got the pushcarts off the street was himself the son of immigrants. The mayor of New York, elected in 1933, Fiorello La Guardia. Now, La Guardia was of Italian descent. He was born in Greenwich Village in 1882. As a politician, he worked his way through state and federal government. Tom, he was actually the U.S. representative at two different times, of course, of two very big districts here in Manhattan. One, which included the Lower East Side, and another, which included another major immigrant neighborhood, East Harlem.
And both of those neighborhoods were very well served, by the way, by pushcarts.
Absolutely.
But as we mentioned in our recent two-part series on Mayor LaGuardia and Robert Moses and the New Deal, LaGuardia came into office with some really big ideas about how to clean up the city and also get it back to work.
Yeah, he had very big ideas and very big promises. For as a representative, he was very aware, of course, of the peddlers' markets that were in his districts, and he was actually strongly against them, but not against the ethnic nature of the pushcart. In fact, what he wanted to do is he wanted pushcart sellers to succeed, but via access to indoor facilities. To quote again from Suzanne Wasserman, but from a different source, a 1988 article, quote, LaGuardia's opposition to the peddlers became an obsession. He believed that his willpower alone could transform peddlers into merchants.
But LaGuardia, it wasn't just pushcarts. LaGuardia was actually against all kinds of unregulated, unlicensed outdoor sellers, right?
Oh, yeah. Oh, sure. I mean, he wanted the streets cleared of all forms of sales that could be considered undignified or lewd. Almost single-handedly, LaGuardia eliminated organ grinders from the Italian quarters of the city in the 1930s by just essentially canceling all licenses from organ grinders.
Wait, organ grinders like guys or gals sitting around cranking out tunes on a little mechanical musical device with, like, monkeys?
Yes, with monkeys.
You're talking monkeys.
Yes. Musicians often set up in the street with dancing monkeys to make a little extra money. LaGuardia had a particular hatred of these as they were often associated with Italian stereotypes. Oh. So he got them off the streets, but he also hated flower vendors. Oh. And at a public hearing in 1938, he even attacked the Good Humor Man.
Talk about lacking good humor. Indeed, you're talking about he got rid of Mr. Softy, basically.
The ice cream man.
The ice cream trucks.
Quote, He said, quote, "Good humor will simply have to adjust itself to doing business under the conditions demanded by a city of 7 million people. You," speaking to the good humor man, there was a good humor man there, "you can adjust yourself by putting up attractive little stores." So this was...
You know who would have been doomed? The naked cowboy.
Oh, no, LaGuardia would have hated the naked cowboy. Well, anyway.
Elmo, Wonder Woman, they'd all be like so swept off the streets of Times Square.
They'd be driven out of Times Square. Well, so this was obviously a very profound mission for him. And so pushcarts were next. From the New York Times in 1938, the headline, "LaGuardia renews war on pushcarts." Quote, "Declaring that pushcart peddlers are a menace to traffic, health, and sanitation, Mayor LaGuardia yesterday appealed to civic organizations to join in a drive to eliminate them from the streets." And he would make good on his promise to get those pushcarts off the street with the creation of new indoor markets that would start opening here in the late 1930s.
But how would those new municipal markets work out for these pushcart peddlers? We'll head to the market right after this. Just a quick word that you can also explore the history of the Lower East Side by joining one of our Bowery Boys walking tours. On our Lower East Side walk, you'll explore Orchard, Essex, and Hester Streets, and many of the spots that we cover on today's show. And there's also our new tour of the secrets and tales of the West Village.
A nice companion to our recent 3-part series on the West Village, plus a new tour, Revolution in Old New York, a perfect way to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence.
And the new subway history tour, and favorites like the Gilded Age mansions of Fifth Avenue and the secrets of Grand Central Terminal tours. Whether you join a public tour or book it as a private, we hope that you'll walk through history with us over at BoweryBoysWalks.com.
So Tom, LaGuardia had a vision to get the pushcarts off the street. Now, what are the details of this big plan?
Well, we're focused here on the retail food markets, but his vision also included, we should note, cleaning up the wholesale food distribution system in the city as well, because that was kind of antiquated. Also, there was rampant corruption as well. So he would use New Deal resources to construct major new market facilities all around the city that focused on wholesaling. But here we're focused on his plans for cleaning up the retail outdoor pushcart markets, which he was also blaming them for price gouging by the vendors, and even worse, of selling off old or spoiled food at inflated prices. His deputy commissioner of the Department of Markets, a man named Michael Fiaschetti, wrote, quote, "It is my belief that ultimately the open-air markets will be supplanted by a system of enclosed markets scattered throughout the city, changing the pushcart peddler of today into the small merchant of tomorrow."
And this is something I alluded to earlier, but it's this idea of granting them some sort of upward mobility, right, in terms of just their social status, but like in their sort of opportunities.
Yes, and so kind of everybody wins. It's good for the customer, it's good for the vendor. And meanwhile, the city then is also, in some ways, returning to its history of being in the market business.
Mm-hmm. So what was the plan to construct those markets?
Well, LaGuardia was looking first to construct these markets in parts of the city that he considered to have the largest pushcart, quote, problem. And in those spots, they would construct indoor markets and then close down the outdoor pushcart markets, moving some of those licensed vendors into the new building, while at the same time also cutting back on the number of total licenses that the city was granting in general to the vendors.
I mean, is that necessarily fair then to all the pushcart operators? Because it doesn't sound like it's including everyone.
No. Well, it's certainly not including the unlicensed vendors, but I don't think the city was really terribly concerned about, the well-being of unlicensed vendors. But it's true that some of the licensed ones simply would not be able to make the move. There wouldn't be enough space, and there were fewer permits.
So where did LaGuardia start then? I mean, there's a lot of places to really begin this experiment. Where does he plant the first market?
Well, in August of 1935, the mayor broke ground on the very first of these new municipal markets, the New Park Avenue Market, which stretched from 111th to 116th along Park Avenue. The New York Times reported on August 25th, quote, "As an effort to solve the perennial pushcart problem, the new Park Avenue Market, for which the mayor broke ground last week, is the most recent and outstanding example. It represents an effort to deal with the small vendor of fruits, vegetables, and perishable foods so that he may be well pleased and so that the public may buy his wares under sanitary conditions."
And when did you say the Park Avenue Market opened?
It opened on May 4th, 1936. And it included 5 modern buildings where there had just, before been the kind of maze of pushcarts. And it was officially opened, of course, by the mayor. And within months, the mayor and his markets commissioner, William Fellows Morgan Jr., were back in the newspaper announcing plans for additional markets to be constructed. On September 16th, 1936, the headline in the Times, "East Side to get new city market. The city will build a new public market on the Lower East Side on Essex Street between Broome and Stanton Streets," William Fellows Morgan Jr., Commissioner of Markets, announced yesterday. It will be constructed on city-owned land now held by the Board of Transportation. A retail section to be housed in 4 buildings will provide 533 stands. When the new market is complete, these stands will be turned over to the merchants who now conduct their business from pushcarts in the markets along Orchard Street, Rivington Street, East Stanton Street, East Houston Street, and Grand Street.
Well, I guess needless to say that Park Avenue Market was a success because you just said, 533 stalls? 4 different buildings? I mean, that's an upgrade.
Clearly, yeah, they were happy with the results, even if, by the way, when the Essex Market would open, it would be slightly less, I think 475. But still, the Park Avenue Market had only been open for a couple of months, and the city was already claiming victory. The article continued, quote, "Construction of the East Side Market is in line with the Market Department's policy of doing away with pushcart markets wherever possible and housing the merchants in public market stalls. The recently opened Harlem Market is the latest example of the working out of this program." And they claim that the residents benefited because the vendors could sell food, often surplus food that was bought cheaply from the wholesale markets, at lower prices than they could at grocery stores, which were now operating throughout the city because these market vendors had much, much lower overhead.
And these corner grocers had been popping up for decades here, but this now seemed like a more cost-effective option for these pushcart sellers as opposed to trying to invest in a grocery store.
And they didn't stop, by the way, with the Essex Street Market, because 3 days later, on September 18th, 1936, the commissioner announced plans for an additional 4 municipal markets in Manhattan that would have space, for hundreds of additional merchants. Not all of those particular markets would end up getting built, but you get the idea. The city was now really embracing the idea of these municipal markets.
But the largest of these markets would be right here in the Lower East Side, the Essex Street Market. But I do wonder, did they know that these pushcart operators would want to do this? I mean, how did they know that this was an attractive option for them?
Well, they knew that they were about to get swept off the streets, first of all.
So they had no choice.
They could read the writing in the streets or on the sidewalks. But in this article about these 4 new markets that the city's rolling out, the commissioner announced that the new Essex Street Market, which had just been announced 3 days before, had already received 275 applications for stalls, including their $15 deposits.
So now we're almost hinting at an opposite problem that could be happening here, which is what happened if it became too popular, right? Because it's a building. It's a limited amount of space.
Yeah. The Essex Street Market would receive thousands of applications, leaving obviously many without a stall and without a place to sell their wares. This shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, where there were once thousands of pushcarts in this neighborhood. Now there would be stalls for 475. And the city was also dramatically reducing the number of licenses to vendors during the same period. They would end up issuing only about a sixth of the number that they had issued before this whole cleanup campaign started. And actually, for those who managed to hold on to a permit, who did not manage to get a stall, okay, they could still sell from their carts, but not within 500 feet of one of these municipal markets.
What had previously been on this land?
Well, there had been tenements and apartment buildings that the city had actually acquired and demolished about 10 years previous to this for the construction of the subway, the 6th Avenue IND Delancey Street station. Greg, we know that F-stop today, Delancey Street, transfer here for the JMZ. But if you think about the F platform at that stop, get off there at Delancey, head upstairs, and if you're on the east side of Essex Street, you basically come out, if you're on the north side of Delancey, you come out alongside what would be the market buildings.
So if they announce the creation of the Essex Market, when did it actually open?
It would take a few years and about $525,000 to construct. And it would be the fourth municipal market to be opened by the city when it opened in 1940. It would follow, obviously the Park Avenue. Then the First Avenue Market would open at 10th Street in late 1938, followed by the 13th Avenue Market in Brooklyn, which is at 13th Avenue and 39th Street, just south of Greenwood Cemetery, which opened in 1939. And then the Essex Street Market would open on January 9th, 1940, and 6 additional municipal markets would follow it, most of which would open within 1 or 2 years of the opening of the Essex Street Market.
And I assume there was a big splashy opening with La Guardia on hand here.
Actually, it sounds like it was a pretty chilly, nondescript, and even kind of harumph of a ceremony. Evidently pretty short. He addressed the crowd quickly, perhaps triumphantly. Or maybe it sounds a little bit annoyed because the Daily News reported the next day about how, as you mentioned, the mayor just didn't want to hear any sentimental reaction to the disappearance of these pushcarts. He said, quote, "The old pushcarts are antiquated, unsanitary, and simply cannot remain on the streets of New York where traffic is so heavy." And then later, more than 3,500 people stood shivering in the cold as the mayor spoke from a small stand on the north end of the market. So yeah, it doesn't really seem like a fun speech, but he got the job done. He got the market opened.
Well, as we roll into the, say, 1950s here, there are a couple interesting forces at work that quickly change the nature of the Essex Street Market. One for good, and another one that's rather troubling. What should we start with, Tom?
Let's start with the good one, I guess. It's been a rough week.
Well, so there's an interesting turnover which is occurring here in immigrant neighborhoods like the Lower East Side in the mid-20th century. You have older Eastern European and Italian residents are moving out of these areas, into the 4 other boroughs and beyond. But then you have new immigrants and population groups that are coming in to take their place. For instance, you have more African Americans moving in to the Lower East Side. And you also had new arrivals from Puerto Rico.
And when does this demographic change take place?
Well, I mean, there of course were many Puerto Ricans coming to New York for many decades, but it was really after World War II that large numbers of Puerto Ricans came to New York seeking work. And, by this time, you had the convenience of air travel in the late 1940s. And so people could come here in larger numbers, thus transforming many neighborhoods all throughout the city. But in particular, here in the Lower East Side, or as it would be called by many, Loisaida.
So then did Puerto Rican merchants make their way into the Essex Street Market?
Yeah, I mean, there would, of course, be Puerto Rican street vendors. Anyone who has ever enjoyed a shaved ice knows this to be true.
I've had one actually at Essex and Delancey in front of the old market.
But Essex Market would soon see stalls here owned by Puerto Rican merchants selling food related to Puerto Rican cuisine. I also want to take the time, by the way, to mention that far up on the island of Manhattan in East Harlem at that old Park Avenue retail market, the one that opened in 1936, it too would see a very similar transformation with brand new immigrant groups coming into that neighborhood. Puerto Rican, but you also had Dominican, Cuban, Mexican, and that market is still there today. A lot of them closed, right? There's still 4. We have Essex and this one, the Park Avenue.
As well as the Arthur Avenue Market and the Moore Street Market, but the other 6 have since closed.
Yeah, but people may know the Park Avenue Market by the name La Marqueta.
Okay, so you've described the good change that was occurring here at the Essex Market.
Positive influence, yes.
Yes. What was the more troubling change taking place?
Well, that came due to a couple big shifts in American life generally. Okay, so in 1930, out in the borough of Queens, in a massive warehouse in Jamaica, Queens, that warehouse was transformed into a King Cullen store, otherwise known as America's first supermarket. Not just a market, but a supermarket, okay? So this built upon the idea of the corner grocer, but was also brought in the ideas of a self-service food shop, all sorts of foods, from breads to dairy, everything. And this is considered the very first supermarket in America.
And that was 1930 in Queens.
Uh-huh.
And of course, these supermarkets would only become more popular and actually get even more convenient with further advances in food distribution and trucking and refrigeration and freezing.
Yeah, I mean, they became the standard for most Americans of where you got your food, right? Food was becoming more prepackaged and preserved, so people didn't actually have to go to the store as frequently as they once did.
Yeah, you could just have TV dinners every night.
Yep. Jello pudding.
Swanson pot pies. But back to Essex Market, I mean, it was sort of like a supermarket. You could buy anything you needed.
It was one-stop shopping, but the problem that it had is that it was in this city building. It was a municipal building designed to look as unoffensive as possible and bland, very unpleasant. Supermarkets, meanwhile, had big windows. They had, almost obnoxiously bright lights and, full color circulars. Supermarkets were a party, right? In addition, Essex was facing the same problems as other mom and pop stores during this time. It was really hard to compete with supermarkets' large inventories and cheaper prices.
And this part of the story is just depressingly familiar.
Yeah.
The small merchants are just up against these behemoths.
Yeah, and then there's even an extra added level that, the neighborhood itself, the Lower East Side, was having many problems, like many areas of New York by the 1960s. So it was having these problems. Those were being reflected, in the aisles of these city markets. And so, sadly, there was an initial plan in 1964 to close all of the markets. This made the front page of the New York Times in the fall of that year, quoting the market commissioner, Albert Pacetta, quote, "They have outlived their usefulness as far as the original purpose is concerned. Very few of the original pushcart peddlers remain as tenants," unquote.
Well, perhaps not the original merchants, but there were still merchants in there, right? I mean,
yeah,
they wouldn't be too thrilled about this. And these markets had only been open for 20 or 25 years.
Yeah, there were still people whose livelihoods were contained in these buildings. And, frankly, Tom, if you want my hot take here.
Please.
The city declaring the problem solved in that quote, we have no further need to operate an affordable market for working class people with a different ethnic makeup than that in which it had begun, is another kind of subtext. In the same article, in fact, he calls the markets, quote, "nothing but a sloppy-looking bunch of supermarkets," unquote.
It sounds like he wasn't a fan.
Absolutely not. But there was still strong support in the neighborhood, strong pushback, and then by 1966, it was agreed that the tenants would collectively lease the building back from the city via the Essex Street Market Merchants Association. And this model would actually be used for all the remaining markets in the city. Now, throughout this period, many of these stalls, like the kind of components of the stalls, the type of things you would find, would actually change. It would reflect, let's just say some rather sometimes even eccentric and unique characteristics of some of the sellers. You would find, whole stalls with Catholic religious items. Sometimes you would even find used furniture and things like that, just resembling somewhat of a flea market, really. But even with these new new additions, it was still one of the most interesting places to see both older and newer cultures in the neighborhood mixed together. In fact, in some vendor classifieds that I found, I was digging into the classifieds
as one does.
Of the New York Daily News, they kept referring to it as the Essex Street Flea Market.
Oh, interesting. And even with its special ambiance here in the 1970s, the Essex Street Market was still serving its primary role as well of providing the neighborhood with affordable food.
Yeah, people still shopped here every day. Now, there was a very brief drama, Tom, in 1979 involving a Cleveland investor who wanted to sweep in here, move into these buildings, and then turn Essex Market into an amusement arcade with billiard tables, pinball machines, and newfangled video games. Space Invaders.
And Frogger. What?
And Froggers. What? 1979, yeah.
Wow. Pre-Ms. Pac-Man. What,
Yes.
What happened? Did he stay in Cleveland?
He did, because it was really shut down by the city. A council person was quoted as saying such a plan would, quote, bring in a bunch of rowdies.
Like only a Donkey Kong machine can.
Well, but by 1986, moving the story forward, there were only 60 vendors here at Essex Market. And a shiny new renovation that was done to the place really failed to spark much energy. Finally, in 1995, operation of Essex Market was then handed back to the city, or in this case, handed to the New York City Economic Development Corporation, which was a nonprofit built to revitalize certain areas of the city and to bring in private partners.
And how did they then plan to reorganize this market, which was sprawling still, right, over several different buildings?
Yeah, so what they did is they took all of the remaining vendors and they just put them in the northern buildings. So those buildings that are north of Delancey Street.
Mm-hmm.
Now, many listeners know that we both lived on the Lower East Side. In fact, now we're entering our era of the story here. And so I remember those southern buildings as really almost always being vacant, right?
Yeah, just kind of waiting for something to happen.
Yeah, and do you remember what was right next to those buildings? There was the old Olympia Diner.
Oh, yeah.
Remember the Olympia Diner on the corner?
So those were market buildings that had been emptied.
Completely emptied, right. But even in those just northern quarters here, even this change was not really enough. And so even more vendors closed. Then another twist to this story, and that is, of course, the Lower East Side changes in another way here in the late 90s and the early 2000s. It becomes more expensive. It is a rapidly gentrifying area with trendy new apartment towers being constructed nearby. In a normal situation, this change would have spelled complete doom for the vendors of Essex Market, who were still, fighting against the tide. There were so many forces against them by this point.
And by apartment towers, you mean like the blue condo that was just a block away, the big blue thing, and the Rivington Hotel that just opened. This is all in the first.
Yeah, that was the blue condo is from 2007. So the neighborhood is making another kind of major change. In September of 2013, a new development was announced for the footprint of that old South Essex Market area, right? In fact, the whole block of Essex and Delancey and Norfolk and Broome, and in fact, many blocks stretching along Delancey would be part of this brand new development. It would be called Essex Crossing, a set of new developments which would include a tower at this corner on this block. And part of the deal with the city is that it would not only be a home for all those existing vendors who are over there on Essex Street Market, north of here, but it would also have much, much more room to expand. Okay, so it could include many more new vendors and local businesses. Not to mention, of course, that the rest of the building includes like a new movie theater and, of course, lots of new housing.
So that was or is called the Essex Crossing Project. And for a number of years, people were talking about that project even while the Essex Market was still operating on the north side of Delancey. And in fact, for many years, I just wanted to throw out there that the Essex Market was like my primary grocery store. I mean, that's where I went to get my groceries, from the fresh produce stands to the bread shop, to the cheese shop, to the coffee dealer. I mean, I remember there being some apprehension about this new plan and about whether or not the small vendors would be able to make that jump over to the new fancier market on the south side.
But they, in fact, did, or at least, many of them made the move from old to new, including some of the originals, many places that had been in those markets for many, many years.
And it's a really diverse group of vendors. When you see them, especially in this new space, you're really struck by the variety of types of food that are still being sold in this marketplace.
Well, it's amazing because of the new kind of open air design of this. I mean, the original Essex Market had high ceilings, but nothing compared to what this current market has. And you're able to kind of take in collectively all the different places, and it really gives you like a slice of the world. All of this is, very much arrayed in a food hall style. In fact, there are actually several more prepared food places amongst these different businesses.
For more on this, including great photos and illustrations of markets and pushcarts through the ages, please visit our website, BoweryBoysHistory.com.
A heartfelt thank you to all of those who support the Bowery Boys podcast on patreon.com. That's patreon.com/Bowery Boys, where for just a small contribution each month, you are helping us keep the show in operation. And from time to time, we give you extra bonus audio.
We also want to give a big thank you to the Essex Market for helping us out, for supporting the show, and helping us with our research. They provided us, among other things, with some great research that had been done for them by Turnstile Studios. So thank you to Essex Market.
Well, thank you very much for listening. Have a great New York week, whether you live here or not.
See you real soon.